One of the most important things to recognize with this list of principles is well, it's actually twofold. One, most of the ideas that Lawler and Worley talk about, I would not at all describe the ideas themselves as particularly new or especially unique. Um, Many of these are ideas that have been out in the ether for even decades. But secondly, alongside that, while most of these ideas are not new or especially unique, many of them are not what most people are accustomed to actually experiencing. Now, some of you may have experienced at least some of, maybe even all of it, but for the average person in a traditional organization, some of these reward principles may seem very counterintuitive, in large part because they don't fit with your actual experience. So let me go through these, starting with the first one, which is to pay the person and not the job. So, very typically in HR practice, we come up with a job description, we give it a title. When we're trying to decide what the compensation range will be, we'll go out and we'll look at similar type jobs, or we'll look within the existing organization for similar jobs to try and identify what the compensation should be. And what this first reward principle is arguing is basically that rather than paying for a title, what you should be paying for is competencies. Now, this is a great example of a reward principle that has its origin at least a couple of decades ago. So it's not new at all. But it's not something that I would say really ever caught on, at least in any widespread way. And part of the reason for that is that trying to decide what a given competency is worth as opposed to what a whole package, a job is worth, is in fact very challenging and not something that most organizations are accustomed to doing. And so there isn't a whole lot of benchmark data available for the organization that decides to think in terms of competencies. But the fundamental idea is that when you pay people for competencies, then they are going to be both intrinsically and extrinsically motivated to try to add on to their competency or their skill set. So they will want to accumulate competencies in the belief that as they add to those competencies, they will increase their compensation. Now, some of what needs to tie into this is a consideration as to whether once someone has achieved a particular competency, is it assumed that they will always have that competency? Or do they need to, on a regular basis, demonstrate that A, they still have that competency, and B, that that competency still has value, or at least the value that has historically been associated with it by the organization? I view this as a reward principle that may seem intuitively sensible, but has some real practical challenges associated with its implementation. Again, trying to ascertain the market value of a given competency or a competency set, I think, this requires a fair number of organizations to sort of step out and be brave and begin doing this so that others can follow in their stead. The second reward principle is one that I seriously doubt anybody would argue with, at least in terms of principle, but again is challenging in practice, and that is to define fairness both strategically and ethically. The authors argue that all organizations should set their pay levels according to the external market. Okay, that makes a lot of presumptions. For example, it presumes that the market, which is basically all of the organizations outside of the existing organization or the focal organization, that somehow their system of compensation has been fairly designed and implemented. And I'm not sure that that assumption is in fact always valid. But the idea is that ultimately what we would do is where within our organization we've decided a particular set of skills or competencies are in fact pivotal. Maybe a phrase that we would have used historically would be something like a core competence. So our organization has certain core competences, things that we're especially good at, and the people who enable those core competences, who have the skills that most enable those core competences to be a strategic advantage for our organization, those skill sets or those competencies should be compensated at a higher level than what the external market is paying. And, logically this makes sense, right? Because you'd say, okay, we want to make sure that the people who are giving the most value added to the organization, we want to make sure that they're being compensated at a high enough rate that they won't think about leaving, at least until we want them to think about leaving. At least that's part of the travel light principle, right? So we want to make sure that we're paying them better. And with things that are less pivotal, less critical, less core, there it's okay if we either pay at the median or even less, with the idea that, well, if they leave, it's not such a big deal because what they're doing, that particular set of skills or competences, isn't something that is essential, isn't something that is part of our strategic advantage. Now, I think it doesn't take a whole lot to start to pick that argument apart. If in fact a particular set of skills is non-pivotal, well then this begs the question, why are we compensating for it at all? At least, why are we compensating for it for people who are regular staff members in our organization? Why don't we outsource that non-pivotal set of competencies? But again, I think there's a fair amount that we could pick at. I think mostly Lawler and Worley are trying to be provocative in the combination of things that they're saying are essential to support what an SMO is all about. The third reward principle is to individualize rewards. Well, I talked about that in the first video. And again, the challenge I think for managers, for leaders, is trying to balance individualizing rewards. What makes Lucy motivated? Is it creating the conditions that will yield more intrinsic rewards, or is she more motivated by tangible and extrinsic rewards versus what gets Matt fired up and what keeps Matt excited, or what gets Ken interested? What are the conditions under which Sue is excited or Elaine is excited, and so on and so forth? What is Joyce looking for? Okay, so we go down that whole list of people, Sherry and Mary. We got everybody, all of you. Okay. How do we make sure that we've maintained equity? How do we make sure that we're not creating the conditions under which people will look around and say, wait a minute, how come you're getting that and I only got this, and so on and so forth. So this is always a challenge, of course, for managers, not just in an SMO, but in any kind of organization. How do you ensure that the reward system is such that people are both individually motivated and also perceive equity? So ultimately, though, this ties back to what, at this point in 2014 is a decades-old approach to compensation, which is to let people use basically a cafeteria approach. So we offer, this kind of insurance and this kind of health care, and we offer et cetera, and you can have this, you can have that. And then, you sort of self-select depending on what really makes you happy. Are you more interested in immediate compensation, or are you more comfortable with, putting it off a little bit and maybe taking a little bit of risk, but then ultimately getting more? Again, a cafeteria approach, this is nothing new. It just ties into the principle that we want to try and individualize. And to the extent that an organization is able to try and create equity, I think that's a great idea. The fourth principle is to not base rewards on the hierarchy. Now this flies in the face of how most organizations operate. Let's be honest. In Western civilization, the way that one typically gets higher compensation is you have to move up in the hierarchy. So one of the consequences of that model is that we end up promoting people into management positions who are very possibly, in fact, highly likely, very good at what they're doing at a given level. In order for them to be compensated, they now have to become a manager, which requires, frankly, a different skill set, which may not be what they're really good at, but it's the only way to get more money, and so they go along with it. But this is in part why we have this phenomenon of the Peter principle, in which people are promoted to the level of their incompetence. So you take someone who's really great at sales and you promote them to the position of sales manager, and for that particular person, the skill set required to be a really effective manager might not be in their bailiwick. And so you've taken someone who was awesome and highly competent and you've promoted them to a level where they're incompetent, but they're willing to go for it because they want a higher level of compensation. So what Lawler and Worley are arguing is that rather than using the hierarchy as sort of the carrot and, you want more money? Great. You gotta get promoted. You're going to have to manage people, manage projects, however you want to think about it. And it can be imagined both ways. Let's not think that way. Let's think instead of, again, skill sets and what is it that people are offering, and let's not think in terms of the hierarchy, and let's enable people to be compensated at higher levels for things other than doing the climb, other than making their way up the chain of command. At the same time, of course, we also have to give great thought and careful consideration to the reality that right now in the corporate world, we really, for the most part, tend to reward upper-level executives at an incredibly high level. In fact, some would argue, at least in some industries, at a level that is impractical and unsustainable and perhaps even questionable from an ethical standpoint. That's another whole conversation. But the market tends to compensate people at a much higher level, given that they're higher in the hierarchy. Many years ago, in the early 1990s, Ben and Jerry, their co-founders, they had decided that they would take relatively low salaries, that their executive compensation would be relatively low. All fine and good, as long as they were the ones in those executive positions. But when the time came and they wanted to relinquish those positions and they wanted other people to come into those executive positions and still follow suit with the lower levels of compensation, there was a huge challenge trying to find successors. So what makes a lot of sense for a given group of people currently occupying the executive level might not work. It might not succeed very well. It might not be something that allows the organization to compete successfully for top executive talent. Of course, Lawler and Worley would argue you shouldn't be looking outside for top executive talent. Again, another conversation. The fifth reward principle, don't base rewards on seniority. This one is actually, again, nothing new in terms of as a principle in general. But for most organizations, it would be new because for the most part, we do have a tendency to reward people for their ability to stick around. So as they're there longer and longer, the base salary creeps up. Okay. It's sort of the pulse theory of employment. You got a pulse? Yeah. You've been here for a while? We'll pay you more. The sixth reward principle is to be transparent. And working in a public institution, this is something to which I'm accustomed. That said, there does seem to be a strongly held belief by many people that if you make compensation information available to people, that they just won't be able to handle it. This is a very patriarchal perspective because these same people typically would not have any problem with the fact that top-level managers have access to all of that pay information, and somehow they're able to walk through and get through the day without breaking down, having all of this information available to them. But somehow people who are lower in the organization, they would not be able to deal with that. I want you to think very carefully about that. What values secrecy and who actually gains by keeping that information secret? Wouldn't it be better if everybody knew how everybody else's pay was deduced? Finally, the last principle, to use identity and purpose as rewards. So if you're really thrilled to be working for the company you work for, that in and of itself will be a reward. The big package, the big story, the big, what it is for any organization, we have to somehow align our reward systems with what we're trying to accomplish. That's the bottom line for SMOs. That's the bottom line for all organizations. The end.